Introducing the bunch who are here in Denmark. My name is Cynthia Grund. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy here at the University of Southern Denmark, and I have the pleasure of hosting this hybrid seminar series entitled The Topics in the Aesthetics of Music and Sound. It's hybrid because people can attend in person if they like, they can attend on Skype if they like, and then they can also attend in a non-interactive manner on YouTube, although it's not completely non-interactive because should they want to leave comments, they may do that as well. So there are three ways to participate in this seminar, some more synchronic than others. So, as I said, it's my pleasure to host this seminar, and then we're sort of a core group of people who run things out of Odense. And so why don't we start with an introduction of our YouTube cameraman, Johnny Harboe.
Yeah, my name is Johnny Harboe. I'm a master in comparative literature here from University of Southern Denmark. I've been listening to metal music for a lot of years, and I'm very interested in what Toni Matti has to tell us today. Yeah.
Yes, and Johnny is one of our very faithful members of the group here, and is planning to attend the metal conference in Helsinki in June.
Yes.
Great. Okay, and then we have over here Vitus Vestergaard.
Yes, hello everybody. My name is Vitus Vestergaard, and I'm an assistant professor here at the University of Southern Denmark at Media Studies. I'm also very interested in metal music, and especially in the visual side of metal music, which I think that we'll be talking a bit about today, actually. So that's just great, and I'm very interested in the connection between the music and the visuals.
And if you're interested, when you go out on our YouTube channel, you can see some videos of the very successful exhibition here in Odense, which Vitus is currently curating, of metal music and various kinds of artistic representations within the graphic world that's associated with metal.
Cool. Yeah, and actually, just in connection with that, just as a small teaser, we're actually talking right now with a metal festival here in Denmark. It's called Copenhagen, and they actually want to exhibit some visual stuff at the festival. So maybe we'll do another exhibition there. So there might be more stuff in the future.
Well, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And another.
But it's just to say that there is actually a big interest within the fan communities and also within a broad audience about these issues, with the bands and brands and images and those sorts of things.
Yes, and the university can't ignore us either. I can just shoot in that we have a slot during the so-called Festival of Research, which is run in Denmark every year on the 25th of April. Yeah. And I'll be presenting the work of our group and also saying something about Vitus's wonderful exhibition. So anyway, the rings are spreading in the water, as it were. So, and we have one more introduction to make here, Mogens.
Yes, I'm Mogens Davidsen, Associate Professor in Danish literature, Nordic literature, trans-aesthetician, and interested in all aspects of sort of the relations between art, music and literature. And metal provides me with new exciting aspects of that.
Yes, that's actually been the case also for me, and then we have one member who hopefully will be showing up. He has to teach a little bit into our seminar, so if he can manage to get free, he will. His name is Claudio Cifuentes Aldenate from Spanish, and he and Mogens and myself have become quite fascinated by metal as an area of exploration for our respective fields within literary studies. Claudio's interested in the sublime, Mogens is very interested in modernism, and then I've been interested in questions of music and meaning for many years. So the three of us are here a bit as newbies. Vitus is a veteran And but we're all learning a lot and enjoying this project quite a bit. So let's move out into Skype land and start with Adriana. Would you like to say a word or two about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi. I'm from the University of Glasgow. I'm currently writing my master thesis on blackboard.
Good to have you here again. Adriana's been with us several times. And Vikram, this is your first time with us. Welcome.
It's my first time with you, yeah. My name is Vikram. I'm from Zurich, Switzerland. I studied design management at the University of Applied Sciences in Lucerne. And I actually wrote in 2012 my bachelor thesis on visual identities and newcomer bands, like a participatory design approach, where I contacted then also Toni, Matti, and he's been a good tutor during my writing phase of this thesis. So, and I was curious to find out now, what's new coming up or what's new happening right now. So.
Great. Well, it's terrific to have you with us, and we hope that you will be attending some of our seminars in the future as well.
Yeah, I hope so. Let's see.
Great. And so now to the star of our show. Welcome, Toni Karjalainen, who is with us from Aalto University in Helsinki, Finland, and is going to give us what I believe will be a very, very exciting presentation about, among other things, branding within metal. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, and yeah, very nice to see you all, and yeah, well, welcome to this session, and greetings from Helsinki. We actually have a very sunny few days here, and
for those who don't know, that's something to be very happy about in Helsinki.
Oh yeah, it has been extraordinarily sunny here. But anyway, so maybe a few words about my background before we start. As quite many of you know that I'm actually in a happy situation right now, so I'm more or less using all of my time doing metal-related research. Or basically I'm studying, well, different topics, but sort of Finnish metal and the export of Finnish metal and internationalization of Finnish metal is like the big topic. But on the side, I've been doing this sort of visual branding studies also in my previous sort of research life, which actually has quite a long story, but I originally started from design research and design management, and really sort of was studying for quite many years how brands are using different visual design elements like product design or graphic design or whatever, package design, as part of their storytelling when they're building brands, strong brands. So consumer products, services, different kind of products. But year by year I started to sort of sneak in these music related issues to my research, and finally now I'm more or less doing that as a whole-time job, which is great. So this visual side of metal and visual branding is not, as I said, it's not a sort of the main topic that I'm doing at the moment. So this presentation is maybe not sort of totally consistent or elegant story as such. It's more like sort of collection of different things and some random stuff. Well, obviously not random, but I will give you some examples from different brands that I've been looking at and that I find somewhat interesting in terms of the visual branding and storytelling. Before that, I'm first going to give you a sort of very brief look into some kind of sort of very basic framework that I've been using in my research, and also maybe some topics to discussion that we can then have after my presentations. And I will try to be not too long, so we will have plenty of time for discussion at the end. But let's see, I always promise this, but then at the end it sort of turns out to be a little different. But yeah, we will, that's at least what we try. All right, and yeah, I'm going to show you some images, and we try to use this screen sharing thing, which I'm not very good at, but when we come there, we will try. I also have this clumsy version of pictures and papers here, just for the case. But yeah, I'm actually starting by a quote, because I think it's a very good quote. I just recently watched a documentary film in Finnish television, and there was a sort of a session about metal and Finnish metal and metal in general. And I think the sort of quote is just an easy way to start, because it was more or less what I'm going to tell you about today. And this is actually translation, it was in Finnish. But anyhow, sort of as a starting point, we could see that an essential part of the attraction of metal music is not only how it sounds, but also how metal looks. Album covers, dressing, stage constructions, posing in photos, facial expressions, posters, spectacular shock effects, and small details telling out the extremely precise aesthetics of the subculture constitute the visual code system of metal. The visual imagery of metal may appear as a stream of frequently repeated cliches for the external world, but with the deepest scrutiny, it is full of nuances and signals that unfold only for the true fans. And I think this sort of summarizing comment is very interesting, not only referring obviously to the visual code system that exists for metal that we are going to talk about today, and actually more or less this whole seminar series I think is quite a lot about. But I think this also the comment that there is something that is only unfolding to the true fans, which really highlights the importance of the context and prior experience in meaning creation or in communication in general. So in order to understand or to interpret certain album cover, let's see as for example progressive metal or death metal or black metal or something else, or understand the album cover also a visual detail as part of the narrative of some specific band, we of course need the prior experience. If we don't know anything about metal or black metal or the different subgenres of bands, obviously we lose a lot of the information that comes in the images. And this kind of subgenre identification in metal is one of the topics I'm very much interested in. I'm actually trying to now, if I can use the print share screen, because I show you an example. Do you see that one?
It's about to show up. It's working. There we are.
Do you see now it as a whole screen or?
Yes.
I can see it, yeah.
I'm just going to see if I can somehow also get rid of some other screens that are in the way. There we go. Okay. Yes. Very good.
Yeah, you see the album covers of band Dream Theater on the screen. Yes, I just took this as an example because, well, it's obviously one of my own favorite bands that I've been also analyzing as part in my research, but also I think it's a good example of this kind of visual communication that comes to the subgenres of metal. I think these are good examples of a sort of typical sort of progressive metal album covers that, for example, Dream Theater is using quite many times, and we would have lots of other examples of this band and many other bands. So it's almost like this kind of photorealistic illustrations of sort of little bit like mystical or mythical topics. And actually, the Black Clouds and the Silver Linings albums that you see, the biggest picture here, it also tells this. With Mike Portnoy, who used to be the founding member and now he's the ex-drummer of the band. But I had an interview with him and we talked quite a lot about this sort of intentional communication that actually, of course, as a progressive metal band, they also try to look like progressive metal bands, and all these album covers like what you see here.
Excuse me, Tony, Matti, we lost your sound for about 5 seconds before you said Portnoy. Can you remember, is there something that we should have heard there that's important for what's coming now?
No idea, but probably nothing essential.
Just making sure.
Yeah. As I said, I sort of interviewed Mike Portnoy before he was kicked out of the band, and he was more or less the mastermind also of many of these sort of visual motifs that they had for album covers and everything. Then they actually cooperated with Hugh Symes, who is an American graphic designer who's been doing a lot of different covers for different bands. But yeah, anyway, as one of their intention was really to also visually show that the band is about progressive music, about progressive metal, whatever you mean by progressive, that's also of course a big discussion. But if you look at the sort of the album covers and different visual materials from many of the so-called progressive metal bands. I think there are sort of lots of similarities of this kind of photorealism and sort of small details explaining a lot of stories and explaining maybe the songs or the ideas or the concepts behind the albums or songs. And I have another example which should show here. You see it now?
We still have the Dream Theater slide.
Yeah, maybe it's coming.
Yes, there we have the next one, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, people, do you know what is this?
OPETH.
Johnny
Yeah,
says OPETH.
Yeah, it's OPETH watershed.
Yeah.
And I took this just another examples because of course OPETH is quite many times also sort of called as a progressive metal band. Of course, in comparison to Dream Theater or many other bands, sort of the story is quite different. But anyway, they go quite many times under that label. But visually speaking, their sort of identity is quite different. They are sort of course, they have very different themes for each of their albums and different material. But I think in general, sort of this kind of more conceptual images and more sort of mythical identities, what is very characteristic of them, especially in comparison to this Dream Theater, which is, as I said, more sort of photorealistic and different kind of sort of story. And I think what is also interesting in OPETH case, which you probably, those of you who know the band and how the quite big transformation that they have gone through their career from this very death metal based kind of music to more sort of traditional progressive style that they have had in their last couple of albums. And again, asking that do you see now the next one?
It will take just a moment until we get
Yeah.
it.
Still don't have it?
No. There we are.
I think again, I always have to push something. Anyway, so that I think these are sort of good examples. The Still Life cover album, the red on the left-hand side is I think is very much telling about the sort of the basic basis of the band idea and the concept, and the music is more about death metal. Of course, you have the sort of certain images like the cross and which is quite obvious and many sort of markers that are sort of suggesting that this is maybe a little bit more about death metal type of music. Of course, again, you have to read it through certain lenses. It doesn't maybe appear as the same for all the different people. And on the right-hand side, you have the Heritage album, not the newest one, but the latest, sort of second newest, which was this more or less a very sort of progressive, in a more 70s type of progressive way, album of OPETH, which was also more or less quite clearly seen on the cover and all the visual images that came with the album, which are sort of there are a lot of stuff that are quite directly referring to this sort of progressive rock heritage in its sense. Of course, there would be a lot of sort of things to discuss more in detail in this band and these albums, but I sort of use this as some kind of introduction to the things that I'm going to talk about, and there will be more examples later on in my presentation. Anyhow, sort of, we perceive these artifacts, products and brands, of course, through different pre-consumption constructed by the experience and the prior encounters with them. The music artifacts as well, they mean different things in different contexts and for different perceivers. And of course, in order to create this kind of meaningful interaction, we really understand the communication in a way that the sort of people who have made these artifacts are mean to understand with those. I argue that the audience, of course, must be familiar with the context, the habits and agreements, and the history of the genre of metal and these different subgenres. Such familiarization and its impact may occur on an implicit or explicit level level, a listener of heavy metal may experience pure aesthetic pleasure generated by elements such as the powerful sonic landscape, high volume, distorted sound, riffing and grooving, and obviously seeing the sort of visual identities or visual images supporting this kind of identity. And it can sort of be then very much different for the people who haven't sort of haven't familiarized themselves with the genre. Even sort of there are lots of elements that don't really have any meanings for people who are not within the genre. And of course, this whole thing, it's not only about the music, but it applies to visual recognition. There is a very rich visual history for heavy metal, full of different symbols, full of different sort of nuances and stories. But I'm not actually discussing or analyzing this context dependency very much in detail. It's more or less like a backbone in my presentation, and that is something that we can, of course, and maybe we should discuss after my talk. But it's almost taken as a given. Many of the examples and many of my sort of analysis, of course, they are sort of supposing this kind of context dependence because of the sort of studies I've been doing. That my own analysis are very much biased because I'm within the genre as a sort of big heavy metal fan myself, and all the sort of interviews and everything I've done with the people within the genre. Of course, there are sort of a lot of meanings that are sort of taken as a given. Anyhow, the same logic, of course, applies to any brands. As said, I've been analyzing sort of different consumer products and brands from product to services and so forth. And of course, the brand recognition always functions on the basis of previous experiences and associations the interpreter have, even though the meanings are in constant development and reinterpretation. For example, if we interpret and recognize, say, Coca-Cola or Apple or Volvo or Nokia to certain visual features, we can call them signature elements of the brand. There is always a certain associative construction that builds on the previous experiences and is triggered and maintained by these visual cues. But of course, this is sort of self-evident. If we couldn't recognize a Coca-Cola bottle if we don't have the previous experience, and that's sort of a little bit like a circle thing to say. But also, it is quite often forgotten. For example, it means that a certain visual consistency is required in order to create visual recognition. So whether it's a brand of a consumer product or a heavy metal brand, you have to have certain consistency in terms of your visual identity in order to create recognition, if that's something that you want to make. So I'm assuming that, like any kind of a product, also the music artifacts can be used as a communicative means of transforming a deliberate strategic intent, as I call it, into an artifact-mediated experience. So the elements of music and various supporting or self-standing visual artifacts, they carry strong symbolic meanings, and they have been traditionally used to great extent within specific music genres, and especially within heavy metal. The visual identity and strong visual communication has been there since the very, very beginning. But as it is often argued by the artists themselves, the starting point for making music, of course, it's not in a way strategic, or it's not about branding per se. The physical concept, of course, may function as a means to channel their creativity, make a statement about the culture or society, or simply as a means of having a good time or playing great music. But of course, as soon as the music production becomes an economic activity for the band, lots of strategic incentives are brought into the picture. For music producers, bands and their stakeholders, creating recognition as well as managing meaning is as important as for any other economic artifacts. But the processes and constructions of meaning creation are a little bit different. And of course, this recognition building is getting increasingly important for the bands, because they are also facing an increasingly growing competition in this whole rapidly changing global music industry, more bands, more music available, and it's very easy to sort of check new bands and new music. It's really harder and harder to stand out from the mass for any band. The core product, the music and the musical concept in its various forms is of course still the most important artifact of differentiation and the closest touch point really for creating loyal fan bases, but the role of various sort of extended artifacts, for example visual identities, is arguably increasing all the time. So in sum, the visual elements are used in an intentional manner to co-create and reinforce a distinctive narrative story of the band, to first foster certain attraction and recognition within the field. And many bands, actually most of the ones that I've been talking to, they do this even quite deliberately, sort of very intentionally, even though they are not always using branding as an explicit term, or they are not sort of almost admitting that we actually sort of pay a lot of attention to these sort of issues that are not at the core of the music making. But of course, as said, whenever the band is becoming bigger and it really has to sell something for its fans, it sort of becomes as an obvious thing. So in my analysis of these different industries, not only music, I have started from an application of the very basic theoretical framework for communication research, which I can sort of show here on the screen again. Do you actually see the screen all the time beside my picture, or how does it work there?
Yes, the way it works is that the screen is mostly filled with your slide, and then there's a small screen of your head talking, and then there's a small screen with us here in Odense.
Yeah. So you see now the three...
Yes, very clearly, thank you.
Cool. Yeah, so this is a very basic sort of framework what I've been basically looking, as said, across different industries, different products, also including these musical artifacts. So first of all, what is the message that the bands or designers and artists they are working with want to convey through various artifacts and visual media? So supporting the musical concept and narratives of the bands, and perhaps construct visual narratives for their own sake. So we're talking about this intent, especially in this kind of strategic intentional communication. What is the intent, or what is the message that you want to communicate? And the second is of course the media. So what kind of visual codes and references, like if you use the term semiotic signs or signature elements, are then designed in the different visual artifacts in an intentional manner. So how, for example, the album cover art or stage design elements and other communication in music, how they function as a sort of media that transmits this message from the producer to the respondent. And of course, response, the sort of, if we talk about the fan response in music context, so how is the message, how is the narrative or the intent interpreted by the respondent at the end of the day? Of course, again, fan on this specific scale, on this specific case. And of course, in generally, what I've been interested in, how and what levels is the visual code system being constructed within the particular context and subculture in which the band is acting. So for example, if I show to the next slide, you see it already?
Yes?
Cool. So at the moment, this is sort of one of the sort of longitudinal studies that I've been doing. So I've been looking at the Finnish symphonic metal band called Nightwish, which I think many recognize. It's by far the biggest and most successful Finnish band ever abroad. But anyhow, I've been looking, especially in connection to their last album, the previous album, the Imaginarium, and then sort of first of all, what is the intent of the band? So I've been doing a lot of analysis and interviews with Tuomas Holopainen, who is the mastermind of the band and main songwriter, and it's more or less the whole father of the Nightwish, and he is more or less writing the script or the narrative of Nightwish through his songwriting, and he's the main man behind all the different strategic choices that the band is doing. And also analyzing not only the Tuomas' personal intent, but what is the intent of the Nightwish as the entire band. And then secondly, how is this intent then transformed through different media? So what I've been doing, I've been looking the album itself, of course, the different parts of the album, the songs, the lyrics, the visual sides, and the different communication that actually came with the album. What I've also been following very actively for quite many years, that how they actually communicate the album through Facebook site, for example, which is quite nice because I think they had at the moment 4.5 million followers on their Facebook site or something like that. So it's really the main channel that they're communicating their ideas. And yeah, of course, as part of the concept, or sort of part of the media, is the world tour that they had after the album. So I was visiting quite many, about 20 different shows, and really seeing how they really transformed the idea into the stage, and how it's presented, and basically how the story is told up on stage. And they also actually made, in the last Imaginarium album, they also made a full feature motion picture based on the same concept, which wasn't a big commercial success, but actually it was a big investment and a really big part of the whole Imaginarium concept. So I've been also analyzing the movie itself. And then what is maybe the most interesting part, or most time-consuming part as well, I've been looking at the fan response. So basically I've been doing interviews with close to 100 Nightwish fans, mainly by email, but also some face-to-face, and about from 30 different countries. So it's quite a nice data that I have at my hand at the moment, so I'm just now wondering what to do with the data. But anyway, I've been looking at what is the interpretation of the fans of this intent or the script, but how they actually understand the Imaginarium, the album as a concept, the different songs, the different themes that come with the album, and what does it actually, what are the elements of Nightwish identity, or of Nightwish brand, if you will, that they actually understand, and how they understand it and how they interpret it. And especially interesting is to see sort of their personal relation with the band, which is, in this case, it's quite deep, because I've been really focusing on these hardcore Nightwish fans that have been fans of the band for quite a long time, and really sort of the band is making a big part of their lives. But I'm also looking at the cultural context, that how the different cultures may affect the interpretation that they have on the band and on the album concept. Because, for example, if you take a fan from Brazil or Trinidad and Tobago, it's quite different interpretation from the fans that, for example, we find here in Finland, or for example Japan, because the culture is different and the whole musical scene is very different. And of course, having the fact that it's Finnish bands, it also means quite a lot of different things for different people in different countries. So this intent, media, fan response as a basic framework is also something that I'm utilizing here in this Nightwish study. And this is like the basic backbone, basic frame that I've been using in many of my studies. Of course, it goes more in detail than when we do the actual studies, but this is like a basic starting point. And in some of my studies and earlier papers, if taking this a little bit further, especially focusing on the intent, if you see the following slide here, my interest has been also in exploring how the various intentional messages, what I call intent categories, are transformed into visual artifacts within this sort of frame of self-reflections, which is the endogenous intent reflecting the personal artistic ideologies or the band's musical concept or the cultural background of the band and its member. And then the recognition building, which is more like the exogenous type of communications, including the categories of categorization, heavy metal traditions, and differentiation, which is more like, this is more like the intentional and very strategic part of positioning yourself into the existing sort of visual history that exists in heavy metal genre or within a certain subgenre. And quite many times, even sort of very explicitly, the bands are talking about this differentiation, that they really want to be visually different from many of the other bands, and it's also quite interesting. So there are these two categories, or two main categories of intent. So the first has to do with this sort of self-reflection. We make music because we want to reflect ourselves and our ideas to the outer world. And the second is this recognition building that really comes close to this kind of very strategic branding efforts that basically all of the bands are more or less doing, either implicitly or most of them also very explicitly. So really the artifacts are regarded as means of visual narration. The intent categories together construct some kind of cultural narrative that through the artifacts gets mediated to and co-created with the fans of the bands. Of course, again, within particular cultural and temporal settings. So even though I've been looking at the visual identity, like on the right-hand side of the picture, of course there's a lyrical identity, musical identity, and a lot of other sort of characteristics that go, of course, with the concept, which you, of course, it's the whole entire concept and the whole holistic communication that, of course, it's important. What is also interesting, especially a little bit like a sidestep here, is the interaction between the band and the visual artist or the designers that they are working with. Quite often, actually, especially when you are looking at the smaller bands, there are people within the bands who also play in the band that do many of the visual decisions, and also some of them even design the covers and design the visual stuff for the bands. But of course, for the bigger bands and let's say for the majority of bands, there are some external people. So there are graphic designers or visual artists that are actually working for the bands. And yeah, actually going further, this we already had. I already talked about the Dream Theater as an example, if you see that here. And I mentioned that they have been doing a lot of collaboration with the American artist and designer Hugh Symes. And actually he's been also doing, if you see the next picture, I just took this as an example because, yeah, great examples of some of his other work, for example, for the Canadian band Rush, which is very characteristics, I think, and also denotes the sort of progressive rock basis of Rush. And then my claim is here actually that you can also, you not only can identify the bands like Dream Theater and Rush and their own specific identity through the images and the specific subgenre that they are representing, but in many of the works you can actually see that there are lots of characteristic elements that you can recognize that there is this one specific artist called Hugh Symes who has been working with these images. So it's not only about the band's intent that comes into the picture, but it's also, of course, the designer intent or the artist intent that they also want to create something unique and something personal in their artwork. And then it's very actually interesting and fascinating topic to think about how these two different worlds come together and what are the processes. Many times, of course, they are very consistent, like Hugh Symes. In this case, of course, they sort of look at the bands and they certainly, of course, fine-tune their visual communication really to correspond to the idea of the bands because they are their clients and that's the sort of world that they want to create their artwork for. But of course, there is always some kind of personal touch that many of these artists also quite actively want to keep up in their work. Like in the next slide, if you see these examples from Travis Smith, is also an American artist, but maybe many of you recognize a lot of the work he's been doing. Again, work for many different bands, including OPETH, Catatonia, Avenged Sevenfold, Nevermore, and many more, but those are the ones that you see in the picture. But again, it's quite interesting because in a way, at least for me, in many of these examples and many other examples, it's quite obvious that the visual outcome looks quite sort of directly that this is something that Travis Smith looks like a Travis Smith work. And this is also something that Travis is, of course, quite intentionally sometimes trying to make, that there are certain techniques, there are certain approaches into his artwork that sort of tend to produce some certain type of images. But at the same time, of course, we have to be very consistent about that when designing an album cover for OPETH, it has to be different from Catatonia, it has to be different from Nevermore or Amorphis that you see in this collage. Because they are different bands, they have different stories and different narratives, so there has to be different type of identity, of course, obviously designed into this. And then, of course, another good example, of course, and one of the classical example, of course, IRON MAIDEN, one of the greatest. If you think about the artwork of Derek Riggs, he's been doing more or less all the sort of classic IRON MAIDEN album covers and many other material. And he's really become as really strong part, and his artwork has become a strong part of the whole IRON MAIDEN narrative just try to think about Iron Maiden without all these images. So totally would be impossible. So his artwork and his interpretation of the songs made by Stephen Harris or whoever is, of course, has become a very, very integral part of the whole Iron Maiden narrative and the whole Iron Maiden brand. So this, again, this relationship between the artist and the band itself, and how the intent is transformed in a different kind of visual communication, I think it's a very interesting one to analyze as well. So in my case studies, I've been looking on the visual narratives mainly on 3 different levels, if we make it very as a sort of very rough generalization. First of all, of course, I've been looking at the band-specific narratives and their representations, so the branding side, the visual narrative, for example, of the band like Iron Maiden, but what are the elements, what are the narrative stories, different details, different sort of concepts and sort of visual ideas that are behind the sort of bands. And secondly, as already said, the genre or the sub-genre specific narratives and representations. For example, what is the visual representation of let's say progressive metal, how the band plays with these traditions and the different like visual markers of that specific sub-genre. And also in general, what kind of statement the band's made visually in terms of the sort of whole heavy metal history, because it of course has its certain strong symbols and sort of visual markers. And quite many bands make quite an explicit choice of following those traditions and so using those symbols, and some other bands make a sort of anti-statement that they say that we don't want to look like a metal band and we want to make our own visual identity. I will come back to this issue with some examples later on. And thirdly, also what is interesting, especially in my current studies, look at the sort of locational narratives and representations that are related to certain country or region that the bands are coming from. Like, for example, Finnish metal tend to have certain images and certain concepts and certain ideas and narratives that are also visually used quite a lot in many of our bands. If we look them as a sort of big bunch of bands, of course, every band, again, they have their own identity and narrative. And of course, from this example, because I have an Iron Maiden here, if we just quickly think about Iron Maiden, of course, the sort of whole narrative of Great Britain, all this sort of war stories and the historical stories that they have in their songs, and then they're of course quite strongly also visually represented in their album covers, and also, yeah, of course, Bruce is always waving the British flags in a certain part of the show. And it's really, the British identity is really a big part of the whole Iron Maiden band, and that's also something that of course they have done quite intentionally. And it's also quite sort of effective. I remember my own sort of teenage times when I first started to really dig Iron Maiden. I think sort of this British identity and was something sort of additionally interesting in their concept, and I probably learned quite a lot of things from the history of England through their songs, even though I didn't sort of see it very explicitly at the time. But this kind of national identity and the different narrative and stories, often quite on a stereotypical level, is of course a big part of the game for quite many bands. And it's also interesting to see from a country like Finland that how these certain characteristics are used as a sort of national branding element. And you have sort of another side that still sort of had this interesting example here. Of course, as Iron Maiden is a big band, and they have also, of course, a lot of different kind of products, and of course this Trooper beer. How many of you have been actually seeing the product or taste the product? Yeah, see some hands there. Anyway, I think it's sort of interesting example from this kind of co-branding point of view, of sort of extensional branding of Iron Maiden, because they also been telling, or Bruce Dickinson has been telling, that it was quite a logical move for the Iron Maiden as a brand to do, because of course England is known for their beer. They are the band that, because of course they could have done like the typical thing that let's make a red wine collection of Iron Maiden, but as such, it wouldn't make any sense from the point of view of Iron Maiden brand, because yeah, they are not coming from France or Spain or Italy or anywhere like that. They're coming from England. So in English, a British band, they have to have a certain handcrafted alley type of beer. Otherwise, it wouldn't be consistent with their narrative. And this is actually something I've not made up this interpretation myself. This is actually Bruce Dickinson who's been telling the story. Also, sort of a year ago, when I was very lucky actually meeting the man himself. But that's the longest story. Let's not go there. Yes, where are you? But yeah, anyhow, sort of my case studies, which I'm next going to sort of bark a little much more in detail. So my case studies show that those in and around the bands are really actively and constantly contemplating how to mediate messages that originate from their artistic concept or musical concept. And this contemplation is to some extent evident in specific visual cues that the bands have created and in their visual communication more generally. And along the chain of creation, production, reproduction and distribution, the visual and other communication serves to create and recreate meanings that are additional or complementary to the concepts of the band, recorded albums or other forms of reproductions. And in my cases, my focus is also on the process by which someone with the band or outside the band, like the external designer in those cases, really translates the idea of the band, the concept, into a deliberate expression of or the strategic intent, which functions through these artifact-mediated compositions. And it's also noticeable that visual communication is subordinate many times to the musical profiles. I've never seen a case that the band would first we have to make a sort of very cool visual identity, so let's create something out of the blue sky. It always followed the musical idea and the concept in the cases that I've been really looking at. Because it's also, the visual communication seems to be very much subordinate to the musical profile, the artistic volition and integrity of the band, which makes it a little bit different from other commercial products. The actions in music or metal music, the actions that can be seen as sort of artificial branding intentions are typically not very much liked, at least not the artists and the main persons behind the concept themselves. And even many times the bands seem to experience this, what we can call a paradox of identity, because they have to balance between their own artistic ideologies, the different fan expectations and perceptions. They sort of, we are the band X and need to have an artistic integrity, doing whatever we want. That's sort of the typical thing that many of their saints. But of course, there are fans with certain expectations, and even though the bands are not typically saying that they write music for the fans, of course it affects, and it must affect a little bit affect the things that they are doing. Especially if you have created certain level of success with certain musical, following the path that you have been creating yourself. But of course, many times it's the path that sort of it's more or less natural for the band and for the people playing in the band. So in most cases, the artistic ideology and the band concept is really the leading driver of the intent. But whether the visual artwork is being produced for an album or poster or another printed or electronic medium or t-shirts or merchandise or for the concert or stage design elements, I really have found that the concept and intent are part of the sort of creative process and a really intentional process, and it's not something that comes out on a sort of in arbitrary fashion. The creation is really taking the form of deliberate composition rather than emergent processes of change. The bands, which I'm going to discuss next, they have been involved in the building and nurturing of consistent identities and reflected in their musical profile. They have a core concept that is varied and versioned to produce sometimes very distinctive themes for individual albums or other deliverables the bands are creating. And what I also find common in these cases, it's a pattern where the ideas of these creative individuals are transposed into the bands these individuals also founded. The bands are more or less mechanisms to translate their ideas into concepts that also the audiences understand in similar ways. The musicians, the individuals in the bands and their audience seem to sort of somehow transform together in ways that is not only a random or emergent process, but more or less a process that is characterized by clear deliberation and intent. So I'll go forward with sort of two very sort of relevant examples. In a way relevant, these are two bands that I'm also very much following throughout the years. Also, but they are relevant because they just are very popular here in Finland. They are also, I'm going to see both of the bands playing on Saturday here in Helsinki. They are also the most popular and good examples of visual communication that I may find sort of from the Finnish metal at the moment, in a way that they have been building up their visual identity and sort of this sort of visual branding quite in a consistent sense. So let's take the first example. How many of you have actually heard about the band called Stamina?
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard some wake yeah there. So somebody maybe have heard about that, but they are actually not.
We're blank here in the studio audience.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. But Stamina is an interesting band. It's one of the, even if we don't count Nightwish in the picture, it's probably even the biggest metal band within the Finnish borders at the time, because they're always selling gold and they go in the first place in the Finnish album chart, gold and platinum records for all of their albums. They've been around for 10 or 15 years now, and yeah, they're very successful here, but they haven't really gone so much abroad, because one of the reasons being that they're actually singing in Finnish and they just haven't sort of still had the idea to go abroad. They have been doing some shows in Germany and actually played in Japan last year, which was very interesting as well. But anyhow, so as you can see from their covers, that they are also very sort of distinctive in terms of the visual identity, and you may not find a very sort of similar type of examples, especially not from the metal circles if you look at that one. And then really the name and the logo of the band, this sort of tooth logo in its various interpretations, they are really used as a strong visual element. And interestingly, they also bear direct references to the concept of the band. Of course, the Stamina as a name, if we start from that, it of course means energy, endurance, resistance, strength, determination, which also is well describing the music and the concert appearance of the band. It's a very energetic band live, and yeah, you just maybe check some of the videos after my presentation and you can sort of certainly agree that the visual identity is very much in line with the musical profile. And what is also interesting detail in their logo is of course the number 1 that is used there's not the I letter but number 1, and the guys are simply saying that the meaning of this was to make the band more unique and really differentiate the name from other bands and brands and other things that are out there. You just try, if you Google Stamina with I, you get a huge number of hits, but if you Google Stamina with number 1, the most of the hits are really the band hits. So it's sort of very simple and very deliberate branding thing that they actually made in the beginning. And the tooth logo that you see here, these are some of the album covers that they have, is another strong signature element that the band is also consistently using in their various products. And this symbol also has a very specific communicative purpose. Actually, it appeared first in the cover of the Väkivaltakunta EP that you see on the higher corner left-hand side. So yeah, and actually it's a Finnish language. This is sort of translate. It's difficult, but it's sort of basically meaning something like a violent empire. But there's also an interesting story to coming with the sort of first first idea of using this tooth here is that the singer and guitarist of the band, Antti Hyren, he told in an interview that this tooth is a very personal and intimate thing, and in this case it is detached, as he told, from its context, which is the mouth, in a violent manner, which also served again well the storyline of that song and actually the whole musical profile of the band, because it's sort of violent type of music in a way. And by chance, actually, the wisdom tooth of Hyrynen was removed at the time, and they actually used a real photo of his tooth in this cover of the EP, because this is actually quite a cool thing and quite a cool object. So let's put it on the cover of our EP, which is sort of a nice story actually. But then after that, so they liked the object so much, they actually developed the idea further by pondering and made a very more graphical representation that you see the yellow album, the Stamina album, which was the first real album of the band. And because they also were thinking that the three roots of the tooth are also representing the three establishing members of the band, so there is also another narrative element on the band. And also, of course, as said, the tooth as a symbol, it was very much denoting the style of the music and the whole ideas that they had behind the band, so they thought that it's a very good symbol. And as commented by Hyrynen and other members in the band, the logo has also proved very functional because it's easy to translate and sort of transpose to different kind of representations. And it works very well in t-shirts and in stage backdrops and different contexts because it's very graphical, it's very clear, and it's a very strong symbol. And also very organic in a way. And I have to say also that it's very distinctive. You don't see the same type of symbol other bands are not using the same type of symbol. So it's something that really visually differentiates the band from the other bands. So that's an interesting example. And actually they have now gone a little bit away from these original ideas. In the next slide, if you see, and this is actually the sort of visual parts of the latest SLK album that was launched last year. And they have a really bit sort of more graphical and more black and white type of imagery for the latest album. And they even sort of have some, sort of not very seriously, but they made even some sort of visual references to some sort of black metal or modern black metal stuff, because they actually used some musical influences also in one of their songs in the album. And they are the band who use a lot of these kind of symbols that they don't always even tell that what does the symbol means, like the main symbol here in the SLK album. I don't think there's still sort of clear explanation what the symbol is actually meaning. So they actually leave a lot of room for the fans and people to think about that what might be the meaning behind the symbol, which you can argue that makes again the sort of relationship with the band a little bit deeper, because you maybe use a little bit more cognitive processes in order to contemplate what's behind the narrative. But as I said, yeah, it's very visual, it's very graphical, it's very interesting band from the sort of visual branding point of view. The next band I want to show you here is actually from the same record company and the sort of more or less the friends of Stamina. It's another Finnish band singing Finnish called MOKOMA, and they are playing sort of edgy thrash metal type of music, which you can arguably again see even from the images, these album covers that you have here. And really MOKOMA is also one of the best examples that I've seen that really use this kind of very consistent visual image that also is an visual image that is very different from many of the other bands, and you can instantly recognize an image that you see that this is something that it belongs to MOKOMA. And as said by Marko Annala, the singer of the band, in one of the interviews, sort of I'm quoting here, "We have probably taken part in breaking the visual world of heavy metal. We have brought out our own visual identity through our cover art and the works of Pirinen, who is Ville Pirinen is the cartoonist and visual artist. Is actually quite famous in Finland, doing a lot of different type of works, but he's really become known also as an artist for MOKOMA Records. So continuing to use, for example, a photo-based album cover instead of Pirisen's graphic. It would feel as fierce as thought of changing one of the dudes in the band. So we have marked that a band can perform metal music without mimicking any internally written aesthetic of the genre. So they have really said it many times that we want to do something different. We don't want to put black covers to our albums. We are not going to use this kind of typical metal themes, even though of course there are some typical metal themes, but the interpretation is quite different. This kind of whole graphical identity is something that they want to do. They want to use colors. Each album has to have a different color because the color is also part of the album concept. And they sometimes even said that it simply has to stand out when you go to the record store. You must see the MOKOMA albums there because they are very different in terms of the colors than most of the black metal albums that you have there on the shelves. So really focusing on sort of visual identity building here as well. So MOKOMA has really managed to create quite a unique and recognizable identity in terms of music, and even more so through its visual identity. They really started to collaborate with this Ville Pirinen, a Finnish cartoonist, artist and visual designer quite early on. His first appeared in the form of highly graphical red rooster on the black background, like you see in the middle of the picture, in the Kurimus album in 2003. Followed by a number of distinctively designed album and single covers. And the approach was further expanded and the style slightly enriched in the later albums like Sydänjuuret here on the right hand top and some of the other artifacts that came with that album. And the latest one, and actually the new that just came out a couple of months ago, is the yellow on the left-hand side, the upper left-hand side, the yellow cover. And what is also interesting, if you sort of get your hands on the MOKOMA covers, they put a lot of effort still on the sort of visual planning of their records. They're usually wrapped in a very nice package, and there are actually separate images done by Ville Pirinen for each of the songs in each of the albums that have their own different visual stories. And it usually, the process goes, if you go a little bit there, that actually Ville is getting the songs or the demos from Marko, who is the main songwriter of the band, and he has sort of first of all quite free hands to make his interpretation of the song, but then at the end they actually discuss with the band and with the singer Marko Annala that what is the sort of right direction to make, and at the very end they sort of make a mutual decision that this is something that we want to do for this specific song and this is something that we want to do for this specific album. So again, there are the artistic intent from the graphic designer and also from the band, but at the end they are more or less sort of blended together. And really much, as commented by the band, the relationship is really integral. Nowadays it would be almost impossible to think about MOKOMA without the graphics of Pirinen, and vice versa. Pirinen's artwork has really become an organic part of MOKOMA's concept. The appearance of MOKOMA is really highly recognizable among metal bands and even more widely in the field of music. So it more or less functions as an exogenous aspect, as an external aspect, while making MOKOMA distinctively recognizable and different in the field. And as such, the highly graphical style of Pirinen is combining simplicity and complexity in a distinct manner, also works as a strong signature element of the band, because the style is consistent even though there are no single images or features that would be repeated in different albums. The MOKOMA logo is also iconic, which you can see, for example, here on the stage design stuff. They're also, not going to stage design, but there's also very typical images of MOKOMA playing up on stage. Anyhow, the logo is iconic, although it's not usually used in the album covers, which is also interesting. You recognize the album covers without the logo. It works as a distinctive and stylish signifier, for example, in their stage sheet, t-shirts, and other unique MOKOMA artifacts. And the sense of purity, honesty, and undressed appearance also dominate the sort of stage design of MOKOMA, they always say that we don't want to get anything extra up on stage. We just go there and have our backdrop with this MOKOMA sign or some graphical image from Ville Pirinen, and that's it. But of course, that's already a statement. You can almost sort of even see from the stage and the ways the guys dress and what kind of guitars they're using, that actually this must be a thrash metal band because it looks like a thrash metal band, and they know it, even they say that we don't do any sort of this kind of things, but they do it more or less like implicitly then. So in addition to bringing a colorful component to the otherwise rather dark lyrical landscape of the band, this visual appearance also reflects the MOKOMA idea and musical profile in an interesting manner, because these high contrasts and the use of strong colors and lines in the visual style of Pirinen also indicate the edgy and, if you will, the rather graphical tonal profile, the musical profile of the band. And the graphical touch also goes well with the rich sort of riff-based songs that you often find from MOKOMA. The visual appearance even functions as a sort of type of instruction to the MOKOMA music, how it should be read and understood, as I argue. So in this kind of semiotic sphere, the visual and musical dimensions have some kind of strong indexical relationship in the MOKOMA case. So you can sort of find a quite direct relationship between the graphical identity and the musical profile. And sort of to make it sort of maybe a little bit clearer, and then in this sort of interesting comparison can be made, for example, the next Finnish band, which is called Amorphis, which is probably see some images here. The swan, red swan in the lake somewhere, but it's one of the sort of very typical, very sort of contemporary amorphous type of images that they use in the latest albums. And interestingly, if you compare that with MOKOMA, both bands actually deal, at least in part of their catalogs, with very typical themes of Finnish nature and mentality, but they differ quite radically both in the musical and visual expressions of these themes. And yeah, if looking at the Amorphis, you couldn't, that's also an interesting comparison, that you couldn't ever imagine this kind of images for MOKOMA, and vice versa. If you look at the MOKOMA graphical images, Amorphis is a band that could never ever use those kind of visuals in their albums and in their representations. And again, of course, this goes with the sort of context of experience and understanding of what are the concepts and ideas and the subgenres of the bands. And of course, it may not make a lot of sense to people who don't know these bands or their music that they're playing. But anyway, there is a direct relationship between the music and the visual representation. And this kind of, actually, Amorphis, in these specific albums that I have here, they have done collaboration with this Travis Smith that I mentioned earlier, and then Travis Smith has been really the translator of the ideas into this kind of visual narratives in many of their latest albums. And again, you can sort of, in a way, recognize the Travis Smith touch in many of these images. The style is very congruent to a lot of other work that he's doing, but at the same time, there is, of course, has to be certain Amorphis type of narratives that in the different specific albums, it actually follows quite directly the concepts and the lyrical ideas that there are in certain albums. But as such, Amorphis is also a good example of this kind of consistent concept building and visual narration that in particular has firm symbolic roots deep in the Finnish soil, so to say. The band was established in 1991, and it has been really one of the pioneering Finnish metal bands in the international markets as well. And what has made Amorphis particularly interesting for many Finnish and foreign fans and helped the band to create a distinctive concept is really the approach of using Finnish folklore and mythology as the basis for their musical identity. The fans that I've been interviewing, many of them are actually saying that this kind of Finnish background and the whole mythology is really the important part of their relationship with the band. That's something that makes the band different from let's say, for example, American metal bands. And if Googling, for example, on Amorphis, we receive, for example, a definition it's quite clearly stating that It's progressive metal band with lyrics and themes based on Finnish national epic Kalevala. I don't know how familiar you are with the Kalevala, but this Finnish national epic was more or less done a couple of hundred years ago, and it's the most translated Finnish literature part in the history of Finland. But of course, not very big, huge international bestseller still. But anyway, it's something that we are. Every single person in Finland is quite familiar with because we read it in the school, and then sort of it's always told that this Kalevala as a national epic, it's somehow characterizing very well the Finnish heritage and history and our state of mind. It's full of this kind of very melancholic kind of stories from the eastern part of Finland where it was actually collected, and it's actually a very good manuscript for a metal band like Amorph because it's full of this kind of dark themes and stories of fighting and killing and warfare and stealing another person's wives and whatever. It's sort of very dark stuff, and it goes well with the metal band, I think. And that's actually like quite many metal bands are using Kalevala as somehow inspiration for the lyrics. Not so much that Amorphis is very directly using some stories from the book in their albums. And really, as said, the use of the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, which is this fictional poem saga describing the stereotypical mentality and historical roots of the Finnish people, is a key ingredient in most of the albums. The Kalevala twist was actually brought to the Amorphis concept in the very beginning of the band's history. First, indirectly in the band's musical identity. When recording their first album, called the Karelian Isthmus, and particularly realized in the second one, which you can see probably here. So Tales from the Thousand Lakes. Yeah, of course, could you name your album more sort of Finnish as they have done here? Probably not. This came up in 1994. At the same time, they came up with the idea to use some folk melodies to color up the otherwise quite typical death or black metal sound. And when writing songs for the Tales album, some stories from Kalevala were used as inspiration because they were seen to connect well with the folk melody lines in the music. And perhaps the dark and harsh stories of Kalevala also suited the death metal scene particularly well, as I said. Actually, the story went more or less so that they were actually on a trip to Sweden, Stockholm, to play one of the gigs there. And on the ferry, they were actually thinking that we don't really have any good topics or themes for our lyrics because we don't want to sort of tell stories about our personal lives or anything like that. So we should come up with some kind of nice idea for our lyrics. And then someone sort of jokingly said first that yeah, let's use Kalevala because it's very stereotypically Finnish and might be good. And it was more or less regarded, I think, first as some kind of inner joke to use it, but then it actually became quite serious and they started really to use it more extensively in the albums. And then actually they got rid of the whole Kalevala thing for a couple of their albums in late 90s because they were already thinking that this is a little bit too much. But actually then after they re-established more or less themselves in sort of 10 years ago, they really made the deliberate decision that we are known as this kind of Kalevala metal band, so we might be better to stick to the concept. And they even started to sort of harness it more extensively in the latest albums. So, in most of the subsequent albums, Amorphis has really based its album lyrics and even entire concept on Kalevala. For example, the lyrics on the Eclipse album in 2005 were written on the basis of the story of Kullervo, the most tragic character of the epic. And the successor, Silent Waters, continued the story, recounting the tale of Lemminkäinen, which is another central character in Kalevala, and his hunt for the swan of Tuonela, which you saw the red swan in the first picture, which is the Tuonela is the underworld in the Kalevala saga. And the album Skyforger 2009 in turn told Kalevala stories to wrap around Seppo Ilmarinen, who is sort of cut-like figure of Kalevala, who in the saga forged, for example, the canopy of the sky and the Sampo, which is the mystical device generating the richness of the world. So references to Kalevala and Finnish nature are reinforced not only by the band's musical identity, but also by the visual themes of the Amorphis albums and related artifacts. And as said already, the album's visual appearance has been very coherent, especially in the last few albums. And as you can see, there are a lot of changes from the Tales album to the latest albums, which is also tells a little bit sort of change of intent, and also describing actually change in the musical profile. If you listen to the Tales album, it's quite different music than, for example, in a couple of latest albums. They have also made a big change in the musical profile, which is more or less also translated into the difference in the visual style. And as an interesting anecdotal illustration of this visual narration, and another interesting co-branding case, if you see the picture here, the singer of the band, Tomi Joutsen, has appeared also in recent advertisement of Kalevala Jewelry, which is another strong Finnish brand that obviously is utilizing the same Finnish heritage and Kalevala as mythology as the core of this concept. As appears in this advertisement, Tervas is a jewel series for a man with roots, as it says here in Finnish, which is very much sort of Finnish typical and goes very well with the amorphous narrative as well. And this is quite interesting, but sort of Tomi's family name, Joutsen, sort of more or less seals the whole consistent narrative, but it is sort of accidental, because Joutsen is swan in English. So it's, of course, it's a perfect name for a Kalevala-inspired band, because this national bird of Finland is a central figure in the saga, and there's an interesting detail in the whole thing, but this is purely accidental. But they have made it also sort of part of the narrative, of course. Joutsen is really his real name. But I think this sort of also this particular picture tells sort of very much a very strong image of this kind of typical stereotype that many other Finnish metal bands are also using, that you stand there in the middle of forest holding these kind of trees, trunk of trees or whatever, and yeah, typical closeness to their nature and all this kind of rootedness that many Finnish bands are really much using as part of their character, a part of their identity building, implicitly or in many times explicitly, as for example in the next example, it's just showing this picture, Insomnium, of course, which is one of the greatest bands that we have here in our country at the moment. And also visually interesting, because they have been very consistent also this identity, as you can see in the album covers, there are always these images of very typical Finnish nature with forests and trees, and like for example in this Across the Dark album, there is the bigger picture, there is this lonely man standing in the bad weather in the middle of forest. You can see some buildings up there also. But the guys in the band, they also sort of jokingly said that this is more or less the characteristic type of their lyrics, that it's mainly about lonely men standing in the middle of the forest, feeling very isolated, and of course it's very melancholic. The wife just left and took all the children with them, and it's sort of pretty miserable kind of life. And yeah, this is of course sort of with the blink in my eye, but this is more or less quite often the story, sort of the lyrical base for many of the Finnish bands. This kind of very melancholic type of approach and really closeness to the nature and the bad weather and so on. And they have really used it as a very consistently as part of the image as well. Then I think, yeah, just take very quick examples before we probably need to have some time for discussion. Another good example from the visual point of view is also another Finnish band, which I start a little bit interaction with these. You probably recognize these two symbols very well. So we have in heart here the international symbol for love, and then of course pentagram, which is quite a lot of used symbol also in heavy metal, not going into the history of the symbol itself. And of course and this pentagram in this case is actually inverted, so it's upside down. And of course when you put them together, it creates something like this, which is a symbol called hardagram, which is used by a Finnish band called Him, and they actually call this as a symbol of metal, which is quite sort of straightforward, coming from the sort of two original meanings of the symbols. And this is actually something that Ville Valo, the main man of the band, came personally at some point of the Hym's career, that he just, in one of the mornings, he just drew this symbol and thought that actually this is quite a good thing, because they were at the time they were recording or doing this album called Love Metal, and then this was quite nice graphical representation for this album, and later on this heartagram became the symbol for the whole band. They have been using it in various contexts in different visual interpretations. And whether you call love metal a subgenre or not, perhaps not, but this is something that the band and actually the media is also quite often using to describe the music of him. It has it's very melancholic, it's certain type of, some people even call it's not real metal, it's more like rock music, but we're not going there in this presentation. But it has some references to the Black Sabbath type of very original metal in its sounds, and of course, as a some kind of branding effort, it totally makes sense. I think it's quite in line with their music, and also the visual representations are also telling that this is music called love metal. There would be longer stories, but I cut it short here. And another examples of course, and looking at the big names of the Finnish music, we have Children of Bodom, which is of course this kind of melodic death metal band, which has become quite successful also in the international market. So in this case, the Reaper theme that you see in many of the albums is not only derived from the traditional imaginary of heavy metal, but it actually also supports the band's intent and musical identity. Because the theme represents the melodic death metal music elements of the band, and the name of the band is also consistent, and the whole visual story is consistent with certain events, tragic events that happened in the Finnish history, when a group of youngsters actually were killed while camping by the Lake Bodom in Espoo, and that's the Children of Bodom actually got his name. So the Reaper theme is really presented in both pictorial and graphic format in the various artifacts of the band, and really much is telling the narrative. Of course, it has different interpretations and so forth. And interestingly enough, of course, there is this story, and the band is known as a Finnish band, but there is not so much typically Finnish type in Finnish stories in the lyrics or visual representations or any other identity parts of Children of Bodom. And it's also something I have to make a small sidestep here, as you see here is a few years back, one of the stage design of Children of Bodom, they had actually the whole car and a lot of stuff. They usually have a lot of interesting and weird stuff up on stage. But here my main idea is actually on the guitar that you see Aleksi Laiho is playing, because that's also one of the very, very strong signature elements, and actually the strong element of the whole Children of Bodom narrative. As you see in the next photo, actually the Aleksi Laiho signature series of guitars is actually, I think it used to be at least the most best-selling single model of ESP for a few years ago, and really Aleksi Laiho has become sort of poster boy for many guitar magazines, and he's really much known for his guitar skills and of course the whole visual form and identity of this guitar is very much designed by Aleksi himself, and he has really become a important part of the stage design, and it's something that also is interestingly representing the music of Nightwish, the music of Children of Bodom quite well. And of course we could think about this role of the guitars and different equipment in the band's identity and what kind of stories they tell is also a very interesting one. Not going there more in detail, but you can take these classical examples. Try to think about Eddie Van Halen without these kind of very, very characteristic guitars that he's been using, and you can immediately relate yourself that this is to almost hear immediately in your head the type of music that he's playing with the guitar. If you would put the Aleksi Laiho's guitar in the hands of Eddie Van Halen, it wouldn't make too much sense, because it's different story, it's different subgenre, it's different type of music, and of course the design of the guitar has to go with the type of music that you are playing. Or you can take, for example, of course, the example of Zakk Wylde, for example, has really become iconic, or the guitar, the bull-eye guitar style has really become iconic for his playing as well. Or if we getting more or less where we started. You can take, for example, OPETH as a sound of guitar, or here, this better picture, you probably see it here. So Mikael Åkerfeldt is playing here the sort of signature, one of the signature models of his. And again, it goes very well with this sort of more progressive style of music that OPETH is playing. Again, if you would put this guitar for Alex live and try to sort of play some authentic death metal, melodic death metal with this guitar, it wouldn't make sense in sort of visual terms, which is quite interesting. Or vice versa, Mikael couldn't play this kind of ESP death metal type of guitar because it doesn't really signal the same things about the music itself. And you have a lot of these examples. They seem to have another here, which is another great Swedish band called Meshuggah, and which are playing very sort of technical, progressive, very sort of specific and distinct type of music, and you couldn't play that music with sort of the visual style of guitars that, for example, Alex Laiho is using, or the Mikael Åkerfeldt of OPETH is using. You have to have a certain sort of type, and they typically have this kind of very black and interestingly shaped guitars, and of course different postures that go well with the guitars and so forth. But it's another interesting and big world to be discussed. And then of course, so Nightwish, as said, it's one of the main main bands I've been following in terms of this branding and intention building. Not going so much in the sort of stories and narratives that they have, but also they have a very distinctive identity that they have been forming for themselves over the years. And it's more or less the communicative intent is really strongly driven by kind of endogenous motives. The very idea of the band is crafted around the ideology and dreams of Tuomas Holopainen, who is the main songwriter and the establisher of the band. And his interest in the notion of escapism and really fleeing from the real world into the land of imagination is what motivates the songwriting, music and lyrics of Nightwish, at least in most of the albums. And as noted by him, he's really motivated by different kind of fantasy themes, and his own personal interests are in, for example, in the worlds created by J.R. Tolkien or Edgar Allan Poe or Lord of the Rings, even some Disney fairy tales that are all subtle sort of referenced in their recent albums. But that would be another long story to tell. And then finally, one of the sort of examples that also we discussed for a longer time, but is the band called, this is perhaps one of my biggest favorites over the years, but also visually very interesting, because again, it's almost impossible to imagine the identity, or imagine the band Tool and their music without these very strong visual illustrations that are created by the artist Alex Gray, that they have been working a couple of albums, like the Lateralus and then 10,000 Days that you see here in the image. And of course the Alex Gray, the visual artist, New York-based artist who is specializing in this kind of spiritual and psychedelic or visionary art. And really the distinctive artwork of Gray has become an element part of meaning creation in the case of Tool. And if you really, I don't know if you're familiar with the band, but if you listen to the music of Tool, especially in this couple of albums, and look at the images and look at the videos and different artworks that Alex Gray has been doing in collaboration with Adam Jones, who is the guitarist and like the visual director of the band, they are very much go hand in hand. They certainly create their own like musical and distinctive world that you cannot sort of find anywhere else. And if you are lucky to see them live, it's a very magnificent and very sort of awesome experience, not only musically but also visually. It's very distinctive, and as this visual identity building is really a strong part of their brand. But unfortunately they are very lazy in doing their records. It's almost 10 years from the last record, and everybody's sort of anxiously waiting for the next one. So let's see when we will see that and what's the visual concept behind that album. But anyhow, again, these are just some examples, and I could have shown you a lot of different ones, and of course you can name a lot of different examples that could be interesting to analyze, and we've seen so many good examples in this seminar series But anyhow, this sort of the process of symbolic meaning creation seems to be in these cases to be particularly stressed in this kind of endogenous communication, where any of these bands is really wishing to transform the idea to various visual manifestation. In addressing the market needs following the external intent, visual media has the primary role of raising attention by building visual references in relation to the visual imagery of heavy metal or the particular subgenre in which the bands are operating. The cultural context and the background of the bands, as well as the other context the bands position themselves. But as already said, always the driving force and the starting point is the personal intent or the artistic intent that these bands or their members are wanting to communicate. And also all these cases, they illustrate rather different approaches to visual communication and use of stylistic features that are really dictated by different external realities, but even more importantly, notable differences in the idea and ideology of the band, resulting in different communications and representations. From the perspective of heavy metal bands, the process of producing meanings within the predefined context occurs at least implicitly. The visual landscape can also be explicitly utilized for the purposes of positioning the band as a metal band in general, and within specific subgenres of metal, often having their own visual codes. But like in the MOKOMA case, the intent can be also actually sort of contradictory. They made it very clear that we don't want to be sort of seen visually as a typical metal band. The categorization is a means to structure a band's concept by building references to other bands with the same kind of music style. And in the case of Finnish metal bands, for example, we noticed that the traditions and the symbolism of heavy metal are either explicitly or implicitly carried on by more contemporary bands that are also used some of the examples here. The current bands often explicitly admit their connection to the genre, and many elements in their musical and visual identity seem to continue the traditions of the genre. So of course it's always this kind of dynamic relationship. And in addition to this implicit meaning creation, the bands have seemingly paid much attention on creating this and nurturing unique and strong concept to explicit communicative means, which we can call this kind of strategic branding, which shapes the bands more competitive in this global music markets that requires clear differentiation. And these concepts, as we saw, are consistently supported through the musical, visual and behavioral identity of the bands through deliberate and well-thought signature elements, like we see many of these examples of. Yeah, this is more or less I had in mind for this session, so I guess we have some time left. I'm sorry again, I noticed that we don't have too much time, but discussion, of course.
But thank you very much. Toni, Matthew, would you mind turning off your screen share now? And then we could see everyone. I believe we will be able to. Yes,
no.
Excellent. So, no, thank you. That was a fantastic introduction to the multimodal world of Finnish metal. I found it intensely interesting. I learned a lot. Let's open the floor for, say, about 10 minutes of discussion. Just if you'd like to say something, just put your hand up in the air. Johnny, would you like to come and sit where we can see you?
Yeah.
So you're
Sorry.
part of the group here? Great. And does anyone have any comments? Yes, please, begin.
I'm interested also, well, thank you very much, Toni, for the presentation. I'm interested on how the bands, or who is representing the band, is communicating with designers, a part of course, the music and the lyrics and the intent. What do they give them, for example, at the beginning when they want to create the new artwork or the new, let's say, CI for the band? What do they give to designers? I mean, and what's the creation process until we reach that point where they say, okay, now this is the point where we're going to go out with it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's quite sort of case specific. So it's a little bit different in each of the cases, of course. So in some of the cases, the relationship is very close. So more or less the designer and the band, or representative of the band, they are sort of deciding everything together and discussing very deeply that what is the intent and what do we want to achieve with this specific illustration. And in some cases, the relationship is a little bit more loose. For example, the tool is an interesting case because I had a chance actually to interview Alex Gray, who is doing the visuals. And if I remember right, it was 2 years ago, he was more or less explaining that the typical process in these two albums was that he actually got more or less sort of the lyrics, and I think there was also sort of some bits of the music, but they didn't actually discuss so much first the sort of the concept that what is that tool or Adam Jones' tool wants to achieve through these visual things. And that was a little bit different because Alex Gray was doing his own artwork anyway, and it was more like that he brought his ideas and some of even his ready artwork, and sort of they discussed could we use this specific artwork in this specific album or in this specific song, and how they would together. So he didn't actually create so many original ideas for the tool, especially not in those albums. So that was, and in some of the cases also, this kind of, it's quite typical that the band, for example, when they, of course, in talking about timing, when the visual images of the album covers are being planned, it's about the same time, and they are sort of doing the demos and really starting sort of recording the music. So it's typical that there is also some kind of ideas of the concept of the album, or the lyrics are sometimes ready, or there are some demos already ready, and they usually, in many cases, they give those to the designers. And in order just to give them some kind of idea that this is the sort of musical direction that we are going, and this is probably something that you just please make your own interpretation of the musical comment. But I have to say that it's always, in any case, is that also the designers, they know the bands very well. They know the music. Some of them are even fans of the music, so they already are in the world. So they more or less know what the band should be. Like Ville Pirinen designing for MOKOMA, he more or less already has the MOKOMA in his head, and he knows what are the different interpretations and what is the sort of what is the sandbox that where he can actually play, that what is allowed and what is not allowed for MOKOMA. So in this kind of very close relationship, it's very automatic. But yeah.
So you wouldn't take the art director of Katy Perry and let him do it?
Yeah, yeah. That's I think I haven't analyzed many sort of other genres so much in detail, but I think it's quite typical for metal that there's, at least in the cases that I have seen, that there is usually quite close relationship between the designer and the band, and there's a lot of thoughts behind the visual concept. So it's not any or arbitrary kind of things that might happen in a more mainstream popular world. Of course, I haven't analyzed, but probably Katy Perry could be a good example. He probably doesn't, because she doesn't probably discuss the concept of the visual concept so much detail with the designers or anything like that. There's something totally like two different processes that are going on.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Any comments here in Odense?
Yeah, thank you very much, Toni. It was very interesting, and I've taken a lot of notes, and I have a lot of things to check up on. So you really gave me a lot of stuff to work on. I don't know a lot about album covers. I know a lot more now, but I do know a little bit about logos. And a good friend of mine is a logo designer, Christoph Speidel, and he's made a lot of logos, like 8,000 or 9,000 logos perhaps. He doesn't really keep track anymore. But he's told me a lot of stories about the process. So I also think that the process is very, very interesting and a very important topic. And I would say, like you said, that it's very different from band to band and from artist to artist, and there are of course huge differences from small bands that are just beginning and huge established bands with a record company to back them and so on. But at a point you said that you didn't have any examples of bands starting out with working on the visual side and then working on their audio side, the musical side of their brand. But actually, Christoph, he told me that he has a couple of examples of bands contacting him without having any music, but they they want a logo to establish their band identity. So and in some cases they know what kind of music they will make, but in other cases they're actually not so sure. They know what they would like to be called, and they know who they are, and then they would actually like something to start with. And he said that in some cases bands get back to him saying that, well, the logo you did for us really impacted the way we make music. Now we've actually been inspired by this visual identity that you made for us. So I was wondering, do you have any comments on that, or any similar examples where the visual side sort of points back to the musical side of the band identity?
That's very interesting, and I think that more or less happened in most of these cases as well, that sort of the visuals at some point they start to even not dictate or not direct at sort of the music, but it has to have some kind of sort of effect.
Right.
It's certainly this kind of bipolar relationship which is very interesting. And of course, this logo discussion is very interesting, especially in death metal or black metal history, because we know that there are certain sort of rules even for that, how a death metal band or black metal band should also look like in terms of the logo. And also interesting in my case is, if you, for example, take Amorphis as an example, their first logo that they had was very much a typical death metal type of logo, and they did it very intentionally because they were the death metal or sort of death/black metal band, and they wanted to show it. But then actually when they changed their musical concept radically, they decided to think that it's not anymore a good logo for us, so they redesigned the logo totally, and it sort of represented the sort of new modern type of Amorphis much more better. And it's very interesting, the same kind of logic, for example, if you look at Toni, the Swedish band, they also started with the death metal band. It was very death metal, the first logo, then it became more like this kind of goth rock type of logo, and finally it's more like modern heavy metal type of logo, which they are more or less now. And then similar stories, there are lots of different kind of things, and the logo is, it's true, it's many times the first visual thing that the bands come up with, because they have to write their band name in a way or another. And of course the logos are very important for the fans of metal, and it's all about logos at some point, and we all have these great examples from the history as well. So it's probably much more important in metal than in any other subgenre.
Okay, we will soon have to wrap up, but let's give everyone a chance who has not come with a comment to do so. Ariana, do you have anything you'd like to say?
Well, it was very interesting, and I was thinking of this band Death Heaven with the album Sunbather, which is so anti-metal as it could be, you know. It has a pink cover with white letters on it. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that? Because it's very... It hasn't been seen before, you know. It's so very anti-branding in a way in the metal world.
Yeah, I don't know the case, so I cannot sort of comment on that very closely. But sounds like if you say that it's sort of anti-metal or something, that of course it's something that probably, I don't know what's the intention that the band has behind the whole thing. Maybe they just want to cause some discussion by doing something differently, and obviously something that really. Of course, this kind of thing is always helps you standing out if you have a very different kind of cover that really gets into your eye. For example, if the advertisement is used in a magazine, or if you see the record in a store or wherever. And of course, I think it's quite a typical strategy in any kind of sort of product area to use that. If you want to really stand out, make sort of very different visual identity, and then of course your eye is just sort of, it's catching your eye more or less. But then of course, if it's very much not in line with your other communication or your musical intent or other than, then you probably have some kind of sort of challenges later on. And of course, if metal, as we know, that part of at least the metal community is very conservative, and there's a lot of discussion if certain band makes a sort of very different type of an album cover for the album that they used to have, and maybe it's sort of, again, some of the traditions of metal or the subgenre, where it's usually a lot of noise is created and sort of nasty comments all around. And it's not an easy genre to do your stuff. if you care about your fans' comments anyway.
Okay, thank you, and as I say, we soon will have to wrap up, so let's give a chance for both Mons and Johnny to come with a brief comment, and then I have a concluding one.
I only want to thank you for the presentation. I find it very interesting because as I'm also interested in the visual side of this and try to dig more into it. And I am particularly interested if there is some ambiguity in sort of the visual identity, because that's what I'm sort of searching for.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can seem quite determined or that they are very literal about their references in terms of mythology and the modern world, but I like to search the area for more ambiguity and even perhaps humor. I don't know how often humor is mentioned in connection with metal, but I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, there are lots of sort of so-called humorous bands, or maybe they have it. But yeah, I think what is quite interesting in many of my examples also, that the designers we talked quite a lot that there are more or less some very small detail or some sort of hidden messages in many of the album covers, that there are like some small symbols or some colors or something that they have actually some more or less hidden as a sort of joke or something else in the covers, and that's typical. Most of the people don't recognize them, but the people who have sort of, they can sort of understand those things. And for example, in one of the MOKOMA covers, Ville Pirinen, I think he was making very small logos, and they were not even direct, but some kind of references to two ice hockey teams that are actually coming from his own city. And if he didn't explain those, I would never have seen those, but now I've always seen those two small symbols in the cover of certain MOKOMA artwork, and I think many of the other designers are also talking about that today, sometimes to do their own small things into the covers, and just to make life more interesting. And at least there are some people who find it amusing, and sort of if they see those references, and probably there's a lot of those, might be interesting to sort of start studying them more in detail.
Very good. Thank you. Johnny?
Yeah, a short comment on the band Death Heaven and their Sunbather cover. I believe I've read somewhere that Death Heaven tried to cut all the black metal ties to the Norwegian scene by releasing an album with a pink cover and with this special Roman letters. So they want to show that they were American and that they played a third generation of American black metal, and that they had a lot of influences from shoegaze too. So they were clearly signaling that they are not on the Dark Throne bandwagon, but they are something else.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I have one final comment then. I'm wondering, when you say that Stamina has become such an important band in Finland, I'm wondering, have they intended Stamina as being an English translation of Sisu?
No, I don't know. I don't.
Because I was thinking when you were defining the characteristics of the concept, stamina, it sounds an awful lot like the definition of Sisu. So, but you don't know of any direct connection there. Hello?
I
think I lost you.
Yeah, yes, I said that when you defined stamina, the concept, it sounded a lot like the definition of Sisu. So that's why I was wondering if that was also some sort of code that people who know something about the Finns would think, Sisu.
I don't know, maybe that's one of hidden references there as well.
Okay, we'll have to investigate that, but at a later time. Thank you so much for this very, very rich presentation. And we look forward to having you, I hope, as a guest in our Skype audience during some of the seminars during the rest of the semester.
Yeah, I'll try.
Okay.